By the time the watch broke his door, the carver had sewn a giant from stolen skin and carved Al-Musawwir into its brow, yet when they cut it open, the statue bled, and something raw and living stared back from inside the hollow chest. In the sweltering heat of the year 1633, the sprawling metropolis of Constantinople was a city of dualities, where the golden holiness of the minarets pierced the heavens while the labyrinthine alleys of the Galata district festered with the sins of the earth. It was here, amidst the stench of fish guts and the clamor of Genoese merchants, that a man named Yaqub maintained a workshop that most locals had learned to avoid by crossing to the other side of the cobblestones. Yaqub was no ordinary carpenter or common whittler of trinkets, but a master artisan whose skill with the chisel bordered on the supernatural, a talent so profound it felt less like a gift and more like a curse placed upon him by something ancient and unseen. His creations were not merely lifeless effigies of wood and lacquer, for he possessed the uncanny ability to capture the micro-expressions of pain, joy, and sorrow with such terrifying precision that his wooden birds were often found pecked to splinters by actual hawks confused by their realism. Yet, despite the coin his talents could command from the wealthy pashas who sought his curiosities, Yaqub lived in squalor, his eyes sunken deep into a skull that seemed too heavy for his neck, his gaze forever fixed on a horizon no one else could perceive. He was a man consumed not by the desire for wealth, but by a theological cancer that had begun to eat away at his sanity, a singular obsession with the 99th name of God found within the holy texts. Al-Musawwir. The fashioner. The shaper of beauty. The one who gives form to chaos. To the pious men of the city, this name was a comfort, a reminder of divine architecture, but to Yaqub, it was a challenge whispered in the dead of night by shadows that stretched too long across his floorboards. He spent his nights poring over dusty manuscripts and anatomical diagrams stolen from the physicians of the West, tracing the lines of muscle and bone with a trembling finger, his mind twisting the holy attribute into a dark question that plagued his every waking moment. He reasoned in his fevered silence that if the Creator had fashioned man from a clot of blood and clay, then the act of creation itself was a mechanical process, a sequence of divine engineering that could be observed, deconstructed, and ultimately replicated by hands steady enough to wield the knife. The wood that had once yielded so beautifully to his touch began to feel dead and unresponsive to him, a vulgar material fit only for coffins and crates, lacking the warmth and the elasticity of the medium he truly desired to master. His workshop, once filled with the pleasant aroma of cedar and sawdust, began to take on a heavier, more metallic scent, as he started to experiment with materials that did not grow from the earth but walked upon it. The local children, who once peeked through the cracks in his shutters to see the marvelous toys, now claimed that the wooden faces staring back at them seemed to be screaming silently, their painted eyes following the movement of the sun with a malice that which should not possess. It was the prelude to a descent into madness that would not only stain the soul of Yaqub but would leave a scar upon the history of the district, a transition from the carving of timber to the sculpting of something far more forbidden, driven by the blasphemous belief that with the right tools, a man could wear the mantle of Al-Musawwir and breathe life into the void. It was in the early days of September in the year 1633 that the heavens finally turned their back on the city, delivering a judgment wrapped in flame that would sear the history of the Ottoman capital forever. The catastrophe began at the Cibali Gate, a spark born from negligence that quickly matured into a voracious beast, fed by the dry timber of the summer-parched houses and the relentless northern wind that whipped the Bosphorus into a frenzy. Within hours, the sky above Constantinople was no longer blue but a choking, bruised purple, illuminated from below by an inferno that consumed 20,000 homes as if they were made of paper and prayer. While the panicked screams of mothers and the desperate shouts of the Janissaries trying to beat back the flames filled the air with a cacophony of terror, Yaqub did not flee toward the water like the rest of the wailing populace. Instead, witnesses who claimed to see him in the haze reported a figure moving with an eerie, sleepwalker's calm against the tide of the refugees, walking deeper into the smoke where the heat was intense enough to singe the eyebrows off a man's face. To Yaqub, the great fire was not a disaster, it was a revelation, a divine unmaking of the world where the chaotic structures of society were stripped away to reveal the raw, agonizing truth beneath. He watched with a clinical, detached fascination as the fire peeled back the layers of the city, but more importantly, he watched what it did to the people who could not escape. He observed the way the intense heat caused the human form to contort, the muscles contracting in the final moments of life to pull limbs into impossible, twisted shapes, a grotesque dance of anatomy that no wooden mannequin could ever replicate. He saw skin blacken and split like overripe fruit, revealing the wet, red machinery of life underneath, and in that horror, he found the answer to the riddle that had plagued him. Wood was static, dead, and stubborn. It could be carved, but it could not flow, it could not stretch, and it could not hold the divine spark he so desperately sought to capture. As the embers finally cooled and the city lay in a ruin of grey ash and weeping survivors, Jacob returned to his workshop in Galata, which had been spared by a capricious shift in the wind, standing like a tombstone in a graveyard of charred rubble. But the man who unlocked the door was not the same artisan who had left it. The fire had burned away the last remnants of his morality, leaving behind only the hard, diamond-like core of his obsession. He immediately ceased all commissions, boarding up the windows of his shop with thick planks of salvaged oak, hammering the nails with a violence that echoed through the silent, morning street. The sweet smell of cedar shavings was soon replaced by a new, noxious atmosphere as he began to order supplies that had no place in a carpenter's trade, utilizing the chaos of the post-fire markets to acquire goods without scrutiny. Porters, paid double to ask no questions, delivered heavy crates of quicksilver, jars of caustic acids used by tanners to strip hide from flesh, and large quantities of natron and preservatives typically reserved for the embalmers of the ancient world. Jacob retreated into his cellar, a subterranean womb of stone where the light of the sun never touched, lit only by the sputtering flames of tallow candles that cast long, dancing shadows against the damp walls. Here, surrounded by sketches he had frantically drawn from memory of the fire's victims, drawings that detailed the precise agony of a dying nerve and the tension of a screaming tendon, he began his true work. The air in the cellar grew thick and heavy, tasting of copper and old blood, a miasma that seemed to cling to his clothes and skin. He spoke to no one, his voice used only to recite the attributes of Al-Musawwir, chanting the name over and over until the syllables lost their meaning and became a rhythmic, guttural pulse that matched the beating of his own heart. He reasoned that to be a true fashioner, one must understand the medium of the soul, and the soul did not reside in oak or pine, it resided in the warm, wet intricate lattice of the vessel God himself had designed. The cellar became a laboratory of the profane, where he experimented with preservation, seeking a way to halt the decay of organic matter, to freeze the elasticity of skin so that it could be worked like the finest leather, pliable yet imperishable. He was preparing to stitch a masterpiece, believing with a maniacal certainty that if he could construct a form perfect enough, a vessel that adhered to the sacred geometry of the divine, the universe would be forced to acknowledge his genius and fill the empty shell with life. The silence of the cellar was a heavy, pregnant thing, waiting to be broken not by the chisel, but by the wet, tearing sound of the knife, as Jacob waited for the city to sleep, his eyes fixed on the darkness, ready to harvest the materials that the fire had shown him were the only true medium for his art. As the year 1634 crept in upon the heels of the devastating winter, a heavy, suffocating silence seemed to drape itself over the cobblestones surrounding Jacob's workshop, a silence that was paradoxically filled with the most unsettling of noises. The restoration of the city had begun elsewhere, with the hammering of nails and the sawing of fresh timber echoing through the districts recovering from the fire, but from behind the barricaded oak door of the artisan, the sounds were altogether different, possessing a texture and a rhythm that made the skin of the passers-by crawl with an instinctual, primal revulsion. It was not the clean, sharp strike of a chisel against wood that drifted up from the cellar grates, but rather a dull, wet thudding, relentless and rhythmic, akin to a butcher tenderizing a slab of tough flank steak for the stew pot. This was often accompanied by a sickening, grinding rasp, the unmistakable sound of serrated iron gnawing through calcium and marrow, a noise that vibrated through the foundations of the adjoining buildings and caused the china in the cupboards of the neighbors to rattle in sympathy with the desecration occurring below. The air in the narrow street, once fragrant with the salt of the sea and the spices of the bazaar, began to curdle with a strange, sweet miasma that defied the chill of the wind. It was a cloying, heavy scent of boiling lavender and strong musk, used desperately and ineffectively to mask the underlying copper tang of fresh blood and the sour, earthy reek of bowels opened to the air. For the first few months, the local populace, superstitious and weary from the fire, convinced themselves that Yaqub was merely engaged in some new, eccentric form of alchemy, perhaps boiling glues from animal hooves or tanning hides for leatherwork, but the disappearances began to erode this fragile denial. It started with the curs of Galata, the mangy, battle-scarred street dogs that roamed the alleys in packs, snarling at shadows and fighting over scraps of fish. These beasts, usually so territorial and loud, began to vanish from the vicinity of the workshop with a startling rapidity, their nocturnal barking silenced not by the city watch, but by a void that seemed to swallow them whole. There were no carcasses left in the street, no signs of struggle, only a deepening quiet where there once was life. Then, as the supply of stray animals dwindled, the hunger of the cellar seemed to grow more ambitious, turning its gaze toward those human souls whom the city had already forgotten. The beggars who huddled for warmth near the warm stones of the hammam walls, the cripples who solicited copper coins near the docks, and the drunkards who lay comatose in the gutters after consuming too much harsh raki, they began to fade from the tapestry of the city, their absence noted by none save the keen-eyed street sweepers and the night watchmen. One particularly grim night, a drunkard known only as Old Hassan, a fixture of the district for 20 years, was seen stumbling towards the faint, flickering light leaking from Yaqub's cellar grate, drawn perhaps by the warmth or a misguided curiosity. He was never seen again, but the following morning, the drain that ran along the side of the workshop was clogged with a thick, gelatinous sludge that turned the water a pale, milky pink. The neighbors, huddled in fearful whispers, spoke of hearing a voice late in the night, a voice that did not sound like a man in prayer but like a man bargaining with the abyss. It was a low, guttural chanting that rose and fell with the rhythm of the wet thuds, a ceaseless repetition of the holy name, Al-Musawwir, Al-Musawwir, spoken with a demanding, hungry intensity that stripped the word of its reverence and clothed it in madness. It was as if Yaqub was trying to summon the attribute of God into his hands by sheer force of will, commanding the flesh to obey him, to knit together and hold its shape against the natural order of decay. The terror reached a fever pitch when a street cleaner, clearing the muck from the gutters near the workshop's threshold, discovered a discarded scrap of material that he initially took to be a piece of fine, pale parchment or perhaps a shaving of strange, translucent leather. Upon closer inspection, under the light of his lantern, the man recoiled in horror, dropping the object as if it were a burning coal. It was a patch of skin, unmistakably human, tanned and cured with a horrifying expertise to the texture of velvet, yet retaining the distinct, swirling pattern of a fingerprint near its jagged edge. It was a rejected scrap, a piece of material deemed unworthy of the grand design, cast out like a wood shaving from a carpenter's bench. This discovery sent a shockwave through the quarter, confirming the darkest suspicions that had been festering in the minds of the locals. Yaqub was no longer a carver of wood, he had become a tailor of flesh, treating the bodies of the lost and the damned as nothing more than raw fabric for his needle. Inside the cellar, the reality was far worse than the rumors could conjure. Yaqub moved through the subterranean gloom with the manic energy of a man possessed, his hands stained permanently with dark fluids, his eyes wide and unblinking, burning with the fever of his great work. He had moved beyond the preservation of mere parts, he was now engaged in assembly. Tables that once held blocks of cedar were now piled high with anatomical horrors, limbs harvested from different victims, chosen for their muscular symmetry and aesthetic perfection, waiting to be joined. Jars of cloudy spirits held eyes of various hues, staring blindly out at their captor, while vats of brine soaked strips of skin to keep them supple. He worked without sleep, driven by the blasphemous conviction that he was on the verge of a breakthrough, that the disparity between the creator and the created was merely a matter of technique. He spoke to the limbs as he sewed them, whispering promises of a new life, a life free from the imperfections of birth, a life crafted by the hand of a master. The atmosphere in that cellar was heavy with the weight of violated nature, a pressure that seemed to bend the candlelight and distort the shadows, as Yaqub, the mad artisan, prepared to stitch together a mosaic of death in his desperate, doomed bid to fashion life. The world outside went on, the muezzins called the faithful to prayer, and the ship sailed the Bosphorus, but in the dark heart of Galata, a new and terrible genesis was taking place, stitch by agonizing stitch. Upon a moonless night in the bleak mid-November of the year 1634, the heavens hung low and oppressive over the district of Galata, draped in a shroud of impenetrable clouds that extinguished the stars and left the winding streets in a Stygian darkness, relieved only by the sporadic, nervous flicker of watch fires. The city was silent, but it was not the peaceful silence of slumber. Rather, it was the held breath of a beast waiting to spring, a tension that had been winding tighter with every passing day of Jacob's seclusion. The air was bitingly cold, carrying the damp chill of the Bosphorus, yet around the boarded-up tenement of the artisan, the atmosphere remained inexplicably humid, thick with a nauseating warmth that seemed to seep from the very stones of the foundation. It was at the hour of the wolf, that indistinct period between midnight and dawn when the soul is said to be most loosely tethered to the body, that the silence was violently murdered. A scream erupted from the depths of Jacob's cellar, a sound so piercing, so fundamentally unnatural, that it shattered the glass of the oil lanterns hanging in the street and caused the feral cats to scatter with bristled tails. It was a vocalization that possessed the dual timbre of a man's utmost terror and a beast's conquering triumph, a harmonious discord of agony and ecstasy that clawed its way up through the grate and echoed off the wooden facades of the sleeping houses, waking the district in a collective cold sweat. Within moments, the shutters of the neighboring homes were thrown open, revealing faces pale with dread, peering into the dark abyss of the street where the echo of the scream still seemed to hang like a physical mist. The city watch, a patrol of hardened janissaries and night guards who had seen the horrors of war and the cruelty of the executioner's block, arrived with a clamor of iron-shod boots and the rattle of scimitars, their torches casting erratic, dancing shadows that stretched and twisted against the walls like restless spirits. The captain of the watch, a scarred veteran named Murad who was known for a constitution of iron, approached the door of the workshop with a hesitation that was foreign to his nature. He pounded upon the iron-reinforced oak with the hilt of his blade, demanding entry in the name of the Sultan, but his voice was swallowed by the heavy silence that had returned to the house, a silence more terrifying than the scream itself because it was heavy with waiting. There was no answer from within, no shuffling of feet, no sound of a latch being drawn, only the faint, rhythmic dripping of something liquid hitting the stone floor below, audible even through the thick timber of the door. Realizing that no invitation would be granted, Murad signaled to his men, and with the grim efficiency of soldiers breaking a siege, they brought their heavy axes to bear against the barrier. The wood, seasoned and strong, groaned under the assault, splintering with loud cracks that sounded like gunshots in the confined alley, until finally, the lock gave way with a screech of tortured metal, and the door swung inward, revealing a hallway plunged in absolute darkness. Almost immediately, the soldiers were forced back, coughing and retching, as a stench of indescribable foulness rolled out from the interior like a physical wave. It was a smell that defied the vocabulary of the living, a complex perfume of rot, sulfur, old blood, and the chemical bite of strong acids, all underlined by that cloying, sweet scent of musk that Jacob had used in vain to mask his sins. It took several moments for the men to steel themselves, tying scarves over their noses and mouths, their eyes watering from the fumes, before they could cross the threshold into the devil's domain. They advanced slowly, their torches held high, the flames sputtering and turning a sickly blue in the oxygen-deprived air, casting long, wavering lights down the narrow staircase that led to the cellar, the throat of the beast from which the scream had birthed. The descent was a journey into a nightmare made manifest. The stone steps were slick with a dark, viscous substance that made footing treacherous, and the walls were covered in strange, frantic scribblings in charcoal and chalk, diagrams of muscles, calculations of leverage, and the repeated, obsessive scrawling of the name, Al-Musawwir, covering every inch of mortar like a protective ward gone wrong. As the boots of the soldiers met the floor of the cellar, the true scope of Jacob's madness was illuminated by the torchlight, revealing a workshop that had been transformed into a charnel house of industrial proportions. This was no longer a place of carpentry, it was an abattoir of the human form, a gallery of failures that assaulted the sanity of those who looked upon it. The room was vast, stretching back into the shadows, and everywhere the eye landed, there was some fresh atrocity, some testament to the artisan's refusal to accept the limits of nature. To the left, upon a workbench once used for planing cedar, lay a pile of discarded limbs, arms and legs that had been severed and then reattached in grotesque configurations, stitched together with a thick, golden thread that glinted mockingly in the firelight. These were the rejected drafts, the sketches in flesh that had not met the master's exacting standards. Some were withered and gray, their preservation failed, while others were horrifyingly fresh, the skin still pink and supple. On the floor, amidst the sawdust which had turned into a bloody paste, were heaps of what looked like wet parchment, but upon closer inspection revealed themselves to be sheets of flayed skin, tanned and stretched on wooden frames, waiting to be cut like fine silk for a suit. The shelves that lined the walls were crowded with glass jars of varying sizes, filled with murky, yellowed spirits in which floated the debris of the stolen dead, eyes that seemed to track the movement of the torches, tongues pinned to cork boards, and hearts that had been pierced with silver needles in an attempt to galvanize them back into a rhythmic beat. The center of the room was dominated by a large, operating table made of stone, equipped with gutters to drain the fluids, and it was here that the horror was most concentrated. Tools of delicate surgical steel lay scattered alongside heavy carpentry rasps and saws, blurring the line between healing and building, between the physician and the builder. There were piles of bone wire, coils of gut string, and bowls filled with a paste made of ground bone and resin, used to sculpt features where the natural bone was lacking. But what chilled the blood of Captain Murad and his men the most was not the gore itself, but the artistry of it. In the corner, propped up like a discard in a puppet maker's shop, was a torso that had been opened and resewn, the ribcage expanded and reinforced with iron struts to hold a larger capacity, a modification that suggested an attempt to improve upon the divine design. It was a workshop of hubris, a place where a man had tried to play God with a needle and a knife, and the air vibrated with the residual energy of extreme suffering. The silence of the cellar was broken only by the ragged breathing of the soldiers and the dripping of fluids from the table to the floor. There was no sign of Yaqub in the immediate vicinity, no figure rushing to defend his work or begging for mercy. There was only the overwhelming evidence of his industry, the sheer volume of biological material suggesting that the disappearances in the district had been far more numerous than anyone had dared to calculate. In the far reaches of the cellar, where the shadows were deepest and the torchlight struggled to penetrate, there stood a large, upright frame, draped in a heavy curtain of dark velvet, motionless and imposing. It stood like a monolith, a shrine to the ultimate purpose of this slaughterhouse. The floor around this veiled object was clean, swept free of the offal that cluttered the rest of the room, suggesting a reverence, a holy space amidst the profane. As the soldiers moved deeper into the room, stepping over the tangled refuse of failed experiments, a hand with 7 fingers, a foot with the heel of a beast, the atmosphere grew heavier, the pressure in the air rising as if the very laws of physics were being bent by what lay behind that curtain. The scream had ended, but the echo of it seemed to be trapped in this stone box, vibrating in the marrow of the intruders, telling them that they were not alone, that the architect of this hell was near, and that the thing he had screamed for, or perhaps, the thing that had screamed at him, was waiting in the suffocating dark to be witnessed. The captain raised his scimitar, his hand trembling for the first time in 20 years of service, and signaled his men to surround the veiled shape, the epicenter of the stench and the fear, knowing with a sinking dread that the true horror was not the scattered pieces on the floor, but the sum of them that stood waiting in the silence. In the trembling silence of that subterranean chamber, where the air was thick enough to be tasted and the darkness seemed to possess a physical weight, the attention of every living soul was drawn inexorably to the center of the room, to that towering, veiled monolith that stood amidst the gore like a dark idol in a temple of offal. Captain Murad, a man who had stood unblinking before the charge of heavy cavalry and had walked through fields of the plague dead without covering his face, now found his heart hammering against his ribs with the frantic, bird-like rhythm of a frightened child. The object beneath the velvet was motionless, yet it radiated a presence that was undeniably, suffocatingly heavy, a gravitational pull of pure malevolence that made the fine hairs on the arms of the Janissaries stand erect like iron filings near a magnet. The torchlight, sputtering in the oxygen-deprived air, cast long, erratic shadows that seemed to claw at the fabric, suggesting movement where there was none, creating the illusion that the thing beneath the shroud was breathing, expanding, and contracting in a slumber that was about to end. The soldiers formed a wide, jagged semicircle around the dais, their scimitars held out before them not as weapons of war, but as trembling talismans against a horror they could not name, their eyes wide and white in the gloom, reflecting the dancing flames and the unspoken question that hung between them: what manner of thing required such a shroud, and what manner of man would craft it in the bowels of the earth? Murad stepped forward, his boots squelching in the sticky residue of the floor, a sound that seemed deafening in the hush. He approached the velvet curtain with a reluctance that was almost painful, his hand extending slowly, fighting the primal instinct that screamed at him to flee, to seal the door with iron and fire and never speak of this place again. But the duty of the watch, and a morbid, fatal curiosity, drove him on. His fingers, calloused from the hilt and the rain, brushed against the fabric. It was not the coarse wool of a common drop cloth, but the finest Genoese velvet, black as the void between stars, soft and heavy, a material fit for the caftan of a sultan, now repurposed to hide a sin against God. He gripped the hem, the fabric cold and damp to the touch, and with a grunt of exertion that broke the spell of silence, he pulled. The heavy cloth did not flutter, it slid away with a slow, sensual heavy friction, pooling around the base of the dais like a puddle of ink, revealing the artisan's magnum opus to the flickering light. A collective gasp, wet and ragged, was torn from the throats of the soldiers, a sound of pure, unadulterated revulsion that bordered on prayer. Standing upon the dais was a figure of terrible, awe-inspiring symmetry, a titan that towered fully 7 feet in height, its proportions adhering to the strictest and most divine laws of mathematics, the golden ratio made manifest in 3 dimensions. But it was not the height that stopped the hearts of the men, it was the material. This was no golem of clay, no automaton of wood and brass, nor was it a waxen effigy meant to deceive the eye from a distance. The figure was a patchwork of human flesh, a seamless, horrifying quilt of skin harvested from the dozens who had vanished into the night, tanned and treated to a state of permanent, glistening perfection. It was a masterpiece of the macabre, a suit of flesh constructed with the obsessive, maniacal precision of a master tailor who had traded silk for the dermis of his neighbors. The chest of the creature was a broad expanse of pale, marble-white skin, likely taken from the backs of strong porters or laborers, stretched tight over a framework of reinforced bone and iron that lay hidden beneath. The muscles were defined not by nature, but by the careful packing of lamb's wool and treated straw under the skin, sculpted to represent the ideal of human strength, a Herculean form that mocked the frailty of the bodies from which it was stolen. The arms hung at its sides, long and powerful, ending in hands that were too large, too perfect, constructed from the fingers of pianists and the palms of bricklayers, stitched together so artfully that the joints seemed ready to articulate, ready to grasp and crush. But it was the stitching that truly horrified the captain. Jacob had not used the coarse catgut of a surgeon, but the finest thread of spun gold, transforming every incision, every junction of severed flesh, into a glittering vein of precious metal. The seams ran down the lengths of the limbs, across the torso, and around the neck, a map of agony traced in gold, turning the act of mutilation into a decorative art. The varying tones of the skin, the olive of the sailor, the pale alabaster of the recluse, the sun-weathered brown of the beggar, were arranged to create a shadowing effect, a chiaroscuro of death that gave the figure a terrifying depth and realism. And yet, for all its terrifying detail, the figure was incomplete, or perhaps, it was completed in a way that defied sanity. The face was a smooth, featureless oval, a blank canvas of taut, unblemished skin that lacked eyes to see, a nose to breathe, or a mouth to scream. It was a visage of absolute negation, a terrifying blankness that reflected the viewer's own horror back at them. There were no ears to hear the pleas of the damned, only the smooth, uninterrupted flow of the golden stitching that ran up from the neck and encircled the skull like a crown of thorns. However, upon the center of where the forehead should be, the smooth skin had been violently disturbed. Carved deep into the flesh, penetrating through the preserved dermis and etching into the bone of the skull beneath, was a single word, inscribed with a jagged, feverish intensity. The letters were not merely cut, they were burned, cauterized into the very foundation of the creature. It was the holy name, the 99th attribute, Al-Musawwir. The fashioner. As the soldiers stared, paralyzed by the blasphemy of it, the air in the room seemed to grow hotter, the smell of musk and copper intensifying until it was a physical taste on the tongue. The stillness of the figure was absolute, yet the craftsmanship was so uncanny, so aggressively lifelike, that the eye refused to accept it as an inanimate object. The play of the torchlight across the oiled skin made the muscles seem to twitch, the chest seemed to heave with a breath that never came. It stood there, a hollow vessel, a shell of stolen humanity waiting to be filled, a direct challenge to the heavens. It was Yaqub's prayer and his curse, a physical demand that the Creator acknowledge the creation, a vessel built to house a god or a demon, rendering the surrounding butchery into something far worse than murder. It was a ritual of becoming. The captain, a man who feared no mortal foe, felt his knees tremble as he realized that the wet sheen on the creature's skin was not merely oil, but a fresh exudation, as if the patchwork hide was sweating, as if the heat of the cellar was interacting with the alchemy of the preservation to create a semblance of life that was more terrifying than any corpse. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, as the men waited for the monster to move, or for the earth to open and swallow them for witnessing such a desecration, their eyes locked on that branded forehead where the name of God burned like an accusation in the dark. The silence that followed the unveiling of the profane colossus was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb that has been sealed for centuries, only to be breached by the frantic beating of a trapped bird. Captain Murad, a man whose soul had been tempered in the fires of the Persian campaigns and whose eyes had witnessed the slaughter of thousands, found himself unable to draw a breath that did not taste of copper and wet ruin. He turned his gaze from the blank, featureless visage of the skin-clad titan to the shadows that clung to the corners of the cellar, expecting, perhaps praying, to see the hunched form of Yaqub the artisan cowering in the gloom, clutching a knife and begging for his wretched life. Yet, the shadows yielded nothing but the scurrying of rats that had grown fat on the artisan's refuse and the drip of fluids falling from the stone tables to the sawdust floor. The soldiers, superstitious men who carried talismans beneath their armor, began to mutter prayers to ward off the evil eye, their scimitars wavering in hands that had lost their strength, for they realized with a creeping, freezing dread that the architect of this slaughterhouse was not among the living debris scattered around the room. The cellar was a sealed box, the door had been barred from the inside, and there was no other exit save the narrow grate through which the scream had escaped. Yaqub had not fled, which meant, by the terrible logic of the situation, he must still be within these stone walls. Murad turned back to the figure on the dais, his eyes narrowing as he sought to reconcile the absence of the man with the presence of the monster. The torchlight flickered violently as a draft from the open door swirled through the chamber, and for a fleeting second, the captain imagined he saw the chest of the patchwork giant heave, a microscopic expansion of the ribcage that defied the laws of the dead. He stepped closer, stepping over a discarded tray of silver needles, and as he breached the invisible circle of reverence Yaqub had established around the dais, a wave of heat struck him in the face. It was not the ambient chill of the cellar, nor the warmth of the torches, but a radiant, feverish heat emanating from the figure itself, the kind of wet, organic warmth one feels when standing close to a fevered horse or a dying man. The skin of the creature, which from a distance appeared like polished marble or cured leather, was up close revealed to be slick with a fine sheen of perspiration, a condensate of humidity and oil that suggested the devastating truth that the interior of this vessel was a furnace of biological activity. Driven by a compulsion that felt like the guiding hand of a nightmare, Murad circled the dais, his boots making wet, sucking sounds on the stone, until he stood behind the towering figure. Here, the artistry of the golden ratio gave way to the brutal necessities of function. Running down the length of the spine, from the base of the skull to the sacrum, was a seam that differed from the delicate, golden embroidery of the limbs. This seam was jagged, angry, and frantic, the stitches uneven and pulled with a desperate, savage tension, as if the needle had been wielded by a hand trembling in the throes of absolute agony. The skin around this dorsal incision was not pale and settled like the rest, it was inflamed, purple and angry, and from the gaps between the crude sutures, a dark, viscous fluid was weeping, trickling down the back of the creature's legs like black tears. It was a wound that had not healed, a closure that had been forced shut against the protest of the volume contained within. With a horror that curdled his blood, Murad realized that the scream they had heard in the street, that dual timbre of terror and triumph, had not been a cry of discovery, but a cry of finality. He raised his heavy dagger, the steel gleaming dully in the gloom, and with a hand that felt as though it belonged to another man, he inserted the tip of the blade into the top of the wet seam, just below the neck. The tension on the threads was so great that as the knife touched them, they snapped with the audible report of a breaking lute string, one after another, pop, 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 unraveling the frantic work of the final moments. As the tension released, the seam burst open, pushed outward by the internal pressure, and a cloud of hot, metallic steam escaped from the cavity, carrying with it the smell of raw meat and the final exhalation of a suffocating soul. The skin of the suit parted like the curtains of a grotesque theater, peeling back to reveal the wet, red reality hidden beneath the stolen dermis. There, encased within the hollowed-out shell of his masterpiece, was Yaqub. But it was not the Yaqub the neighbors knew, not the recluse with the heavy brow and the cedar-scented hands. The man revealed in the cavity was a raw, red anatomy, a figure from a physician's nightmare. In his final, total descent into the madness of Al-Musawwir, Yaqub had sought to become the soul of his creation, to wear the perfection he had stitched together, believing that by inhabiting the ideal form, he would transcend the mortal clay. To fit inside the skin of another, to slide into the tight, seamless envelope of the patchwork man, he had performed the ultimate act of autodissection, he had flayed himself. Piece by agonized piece, he had stripped the skin from his own body, leaving behind the barrier between himself and the world, reducing himself to a weeping man of muscle and nerve, a raw sensitivity that would feel every stitch of the suit as a brand of fire. He was jammed into the casing, his limbs forced into the hollowed arms and legs of the giant, his face pressed against the back of the blank, featureless mask. His eyes, wide and staring, were visible now that the light hit the raw interior, fixed in a permanent expression of realization and regret. He had pulled the skin shut behind him, stitching himself into his own coffin with a mechanism of hooks and internal loops, trapping himself in the dark, hot, airless embrace of the dead. The heat the captain had felt was the final, feverish burn of Yaqub's dying metabolism, the heat of a man boiling in his own juices, suffocated not by water or smoke, but by the crushing, claustrophobic weight of the perfection he had coveted. His mouth was open in a silent scream, pressed against the leather of the mask, a scream that had no air to carry it, a plea for a breath that the featureless face could not provide. The soldiers, witnessing the contents of the cocoon, recoiled with cries of disgust, some falling to their knees to vomit onto the bloody floor, their minds unable to process the sheer geometrical impossibility of the suicide. Murad stood frozen, staring into the dead eyes of the artisan, seeing in them the reflection of a hubris that dwarfed the fires of hell. Yaqub had wanted to be the shaper, the fashioner, the one who gives form. In his madness, he had succeeded only in becoming the filler, the meat in a casing of horror, dying in the absolute dark, wrapped in the skins of his victims, intimate with their death in a way no lover could ever be. He had sought to birth a god, but had only managed to construct a gilded cage for his own rotting corpse. As the captain turned away, unable to bear the sight of the raw, red thing that had once been a man, the heavy velvet curtain was thrown back over the abomination, leaving the statue standing in the dark once more, a hollow lie on the outside, a screaming truth on the inside, a monument to the artisan who carved away his own humanity until there was nothing left but the raw, weeping meat of his sin. The candle on the workbench sputtered and died, plunging the cellar into darkness, leaving the men alone with the wet sound of the fluid still dripping from the open seam, a rhythmic ticking that sounded like the final, fading heartbeat of a city that had looked too deep into the fire and found only its own reflection staring back.